Thank you, everybody, for coming out on a Monday. Yeah, I'm glad you're here. And I am glad to be here. I know, Mississippian, grew up in Jackson for the most part. I live now just outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland, but happy to be down here. Going to be here all week. With my friend Cliff Johnson this afternoon at the University of Mississippi Law School. We'll be tomorrow at Lemuria Books in Jackson, then at St. Philip's Episcopal Church down in Jackson on Wednesday night, and at University Baptist Church on Friday night in Hattiesburg. So if you got friends and relatives down that way, let them know. I'll be happy to see them. So I thought I'd start out by just reading a little bit from, I won't read a lot, but I thought I'd read a little from the opening of the book, which is actually a story that I came across quite late in the research process. But it's a story that I think brings together some themes that I was trying to bring together in the book. And so it's one of those things where, as a writer, it originally existed in chapter 6, right? In one place, and I realized, oh no, actually, this is a microcosm and a window in to really the bigger story that I'm trying to tell. So in migrating to the front. So I'll start with that story and kind of unpack kind of what I'm up to and tell a little bit more about myself as well. And then we'll take some questions, so I want to make sure we have some interaction here. On May 4th, 1863, the steamboat Northerner pushed up the Mississippi River from St. Louis, bound for Fort Snelling, a military outpost north of St. Paul, Minnesota. Just a few miles into the journey, Captain Alfred J. Woods encountered a large handmade raft adrift in the strong currents. Aboard were 76 African Americans, 40 men, 10 women, and 26 children. The leader of this determined group was Robert Hickman, who was attempting to free himself, along with his family and neighbors, from enslavement on a plantation in Boone County, Missouri. Hickman, a preacher who could both read and write, had seen newspaper accounts of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation just 4 months earlier. Although the proclamation did not apply to Missouri because it was under Union control, this news nonetheless inspired him to begin making plans to escape north. The Hickman party aimed to reach free soil by way of the Mississippi River, which was by then safely patrolled by the Union Army. They embarked under cover of darkness on the moonless night of May 3rd, but because their makeshift raft was not equipped with sails or oars, they drifted for a day in the wrong direction before encountering the Northerner. Seeing the floundering party with so many children aboard, Captain Woods asked if they needed assistance. Sympathetic to their plight and knowing that the strains of the Civil War had left Minnesotans with a labor shortage, Woods ordered the raft to be securely tied to the steamboat and offered to take them as far as its final destination. Neither Woods nor Hickman anticipated the vitriol that awaited them. On May 5th, the Northerner approached the levee and lower town on the outskirts of St. Paul. As local dock workers, mostly Irish, caught sight of the self-emancipated African Americans, commonly referred to as contraband by whites, on the trailing raft, they became increasingly agitated, seeing them as competition for jobs. As word spread, a threatening crowd gathered on the levee. The commotion was so great that St. Paul police arrived on the scene, but after assessing the situation, they sided with the mob and threatened to arrest not the Irish rabble-rousers, but the black asylum seekers should they disembark. Captain Woods ordered the boat with his trailing raft to steam on to Fort Snelling. There, Hickman and his party came ashore without incident on May 5th, but they were met with an unexpected sight. Hundreds of disheveled Native Americans were huddled together, forcibly assembled near the docks. The desperate and anxious crowd they encountered were part of an original group numbering more than 1,600, mostly women, children, and elderly Dakota people, who had been held under armed guard all winter, following the Dakota War of the year before, in a miserable encampment on the lowland area below Fort Snelling. Unbeknownst to them, Minnesota government officials and military leaders were waiting the spring thaw that would allow their mass deportation downriver from their ancestral homelands to a bleak reservation in the Nebraska Territory. By the time the ice finally melted and river levels rose, hundreds had died. A group of 770 Dakota people had been shipped off the day before on another steamer, the Davenport. Having set the Hickman party safely ashore and unloaded the wagons and supplies for the military fort, Captain Woods ordered preparations to receive his next cargo, 547 Dakota people, whom he was transporting for the fee of $25 per head plus 10 cents a day for sustenance. Soldiers from Fort Snelling herded the ragtag remnant aboard the Northerner like so many cattle, as one observer put it. As they pulled away, a local minister's wife remarked, "May God have mercy on them, for they can expect none from man." Neither Hickman and his companions nor the Dakota people would have had the perspective to realize they were witnessing a momentous final chapter of both chattel slavery in the U.S. and Indian removal, as it was known, in Minnesota. They would not have grasped the paradox the two groups represented that afternoon on the banks of the Mississippi River. The end of bondage for Hickman's band also marked the last vestige of sovereignty for the Dakota people. And they would certainly have been unaware that in the closing weeks of 1862, just 5 months earlier, President Lincoln was simultaneously considering two documents that would dramatically change the fates of each group. A warrant for the mass execution of 38 Dakota men and the Emancipation Proclamation. This encounter on May 5th, 1863 contains multiple narrative streams, each of which tells a different story about America. The question is, which do we follow? Do we tell the story of Fort Snelling, the military outpost established to protect the westward expansion of settler colonialism? Do we embark back down the Mississippi River to Missouri and the story of enslaved Africans in the South? Do we push upriver from St. Paul to its headwaters and stories of indigenous people populating this land for millennia? Or do we portage east and cross the larger waters connected to the homelands of Europeans who first set foot on these shores just a few hundred years ago? Each narrative pushes back to a different beginning. So that's the opening of the book. What I realized I was trying to do as the book progressed was to tell a fuller story, right, of America, of every local place that we live in, that goes beyond, I think, just the kind of black-white binary that I think particularly Southern history is attempted to be in. And it really tells not only the story of European and African interactions, but European and indigenous interactions that came before that. So that's really what the book is trying to do. And the main reason is that both, and when you do that, you see this common thread, that both of these stories were really fueled by this assertion that people of European descent were somehow superior, right, and entitled not just to land, but to the labor of others, right? That's the common thread running through that. But even that story, I'm finding, and here I am a religious studies scholar and sociologist by training, doesn't actually tell the full story. That behind that, and to really understand our past and our current troubles, I might add, we have to understand the central role that Christianity played in these stories. That often gets left to the side. It's a story about racial animus, but we forget the story that Christianity played, and the role that it played, particularly as it was wielded by white Europeans in this context. And if we do that, the story actually begins, we have to start our story 3 centuries before the thing that we most often have in our minds, and that is that little postage stamp image of the white men gathered in Philadelphia with their quill pens, right, ready to sign the Declaration of Independence there. And that's still very much alive and well as today. My 13-year-old son just came home with his new American history textbook. We live in Maryland. It's actually a fairly progressive county in Montgomery County, Maryland. And on it is this painting, you'd probably say the spirit of 1776. It's a bunch of white men marching with their fifes and drums, right? One was wounded, got a thing around his head. But it's the story of white men marching for independence, right? That is what you get from that single snapshot image on the front of the textbook. But what happens if we begin it before that? And we've already had one iteration of this, right, with the 1619 project that came up just in the last few years to great acclaim. It has sold more newspapers to the New York Times than they've ever sold. And one, as many of you may have seen, kind of crazy, they were up on eBay for hundreds of dollars, right, because they sold out almost immediately. It's now a best-selling book. There's an entire curriculum out that a lot of schools are using. And that was really just decentering, right, 1776 to another time, right? Instead of that picture of the white men marching for freedom or signing the Declaration of Independence, it's the image that goes along with that, right, is this ship, right, of the first captive Africans arriving in the British colonies in 1619. So if you start the story there, you get a different ending. I'm going to suggest that like a kind of yes and, I think, to that move. I think it's like a vital historical move. But I would suggest that we need to actually keep moving back, and we need to keep widening the camera lens, kind of opening up the aperture. So if we keep going past 1619, I'm going to suggest, and there's no perfect date here, but I'm going to suggest one that I'm hoping that people will have in their heads. It's 1492. Thank you for that. So what do we all learn? We all learn, right? 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? This kind of rhyme we learned in elementary school. But in terms of the events that set the moral and religious compass for how Europeans interacted with indigenous people and later with enslaved Africans is actually what happens in 1493. And that is the year actually that Columbus goes back, right, to Spain. So when he goes back and he says, yes, I've discovered, right, these new lands, right, and what does he want? He wants more. He wants more ships, more soldiers, more missionaries, and he wants a broader mandate. And that mandate, right, is to colonize. That's the permission that he wants. So he has a couple things he does. He tries to get that first and foremost from his political sponsors, right, the King and Queen of Spain. They are happy to grant that, seeing all kinds of wealth and ways to exploit these new lands. But here's the key that often gets left out of that history. Where else does he go? Because he not only needs a political mandate, he needs a moral mandate for what he's about to do. And so who does he look to but the Christian church in Europe, right? And so who was the head of the Christian church in Western Europe at the time? Well, it is before the Catholic-Protestant split. It is before the break of the Church of England with the Roman Catholic Church. So all that happens after 1500. So in 1493, there's still only one head of the Western Christian Church, and that is the Pope in Rome. So he appeals there, as many had done, and in 1493, there's the culmination of nearly 50 years of theological doctrine that has been developed since between 1452 and 1493. It came to be known as the doctrine of discovery. Right? And this is a term that we really ought to all know. It's a term I didn't know. So here I'm a PhD in religion, not anything I really could have told you about even 5 years ago. And yet, I think it's fatal, really, for the way that Europeans then interact with the New World. And so what happens is the logic of the doctrine goes this way. And it's developed, it's over decades, but essentially the key moral logic that gets fleshed out in theological terms is this. If any Europeans encounter lands that are inhabited by people who are not Christian, then all kinds of things follow. Right? They have the right to conquer the land, steal their goods, and it's all about not only a political thing, but it's about, talks about them as being the enemies of Christ, is the language that's used in the official documents, and that they are really to be subdued, overthrown, conquered, all this language, and then including the language in one of the earlier documents, in the Doctrine of Discovery, that has this language that says, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Right? That's in the document from the head of the Christian church, and that sets in motion, right, the entire colonial project. Right? So if you kind of think about that, right, as the thing that sets in motion the entire Western posture toward indigenous people, because the key to whether anyone had anything like innate human rights was whether they were Christian or not. That was really, and the only caveat, they later developed a caveat. But get this, the only caveat they developed to that is if they were Christian and not already under the authority of another Christian nation. Right? So there was a provision to keep them from spilling blood between Christian nations, right, if somebody else had preempted them from getting there. But still, the criteria is, are they Christian or have they been forcibly converted into Christianity under control of a Christian nation? So all that to say, like, this whole vocabulary that we still have percolating around in our culture. So things like manifest destiny, a new Zion, right? You hear this in Christian hymns and kind of patriotic writing. A city set on a hill. These biblical allusions that get recycled even today, all have their roots, right, in this sense of European Christian chosenness, right? So this idea that America, at its root, at its core, is essentially a promised land for European Christians. That's who it's for, and it's divinely set aside for that. So that's kind of the core insight, I think, that I'm kind of working with. And then in the book, what I do is I try to look at where is this with us today, and how is this still holding us back from the idea that we're a pluralistic democracy? Because after all, we cannot both be a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians and a pluralistic democracy, right, where everybody stands on equal terms in front of the law, no matter what their race or religion. So I'm kind of unpacking that in the book, and one of the ways I do that is I can unpack this when we do questions and answers in a minute, but I go to 3 places in the book, and I spend some time hanging out in each of these places and talking to people who are reckoning with this legacy in different ways today. So one of them is our home state of Mississippi. So I spent some time hanging out with the good folks in Tallahatchie County, who've been working on the memorial work around Emmett Till and his legacy in Tallahatchie County. And the Emmett Till Memorial Commission, which is really started a couple decades ago, and through those efforts, just recently I had the privilege of being in D.C. And for the announcement of the new Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument that President Biden just announced in August. That's, again, the culmination of a couple of decades of work of folks on the ground there. But to give you a taste of it, like one of the things there's a sense of the book that I say something like, that Emmett Till was born in 1941, but if we're really going to understand his story, we have to go back to 1541, right, to when De Soto shows up on the Mississippi River, is kind of credited as the first person to actually make contact with the Mississippi River. And what's interesting about that, so I'm from D.C. Now, and in the rotunda of the Capitol, there are 4 gigantic 8 by 12 foot paintings around the rotunda of the Capitol. One of those is still Hernando's discovery of the Mississippi. If you look at that painting, it has all the things I was just talking about with the Christian doctrine of discovery embedded in it. And we've become so accustomed to seeing these that we don't really register what they're saying. So I'll describe it to you a bit. So again, 8 by 12 painting, and the first thing you see when you look at the painting is De Soto, and he is up in his 16th century finery in a big white horse, of course, in the middle of this Native American village, and all the Native Americans are sort of cowering. They're sort of half clothed and cowering back from this fine-looking specimen on his horse. Around him, on the left side of the painting, are all the soldiers, and they are decked out for war, right? And all on the bottom of the painting are cannon, and you can tell they've been in a fight. Some are bandaged up. Cannon, axes, swords, like implements of war. And then as you come across the bottom of the painting, in the bottom right-hand side is an image of them raising this giant crucifix, right, in the middle of the Native American village, right? And it's probably, looks from the scale of the painting, probably 20 feet tall. This thing that they're propping up there, and under that is a Spanish monk reading this document called the Requiremento, which was a document basically announcing their claim on these lands that they're currently living on, right? And in the name of the state and in Christianity. But this idea, right, that Christianity just enabled them to do that, I think we take it for granted. We see those little crucifixes with the flags, but it is actually an enactment of claim, right, to the land right there. And it still sits in our rotunda today, right, as one of 4 paintings talking about the establishment of the United States, right? So this is still with us very much here. The other 2 places I go in the book are Oklahoma and Tulsa, which many of you may have seen. It happened during COVID, so most of you didn't go, but there was the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Happened in 2021, a big commemoration of that event, one of the worst events of racial violence in the country. And then the 3rd place that I go in the book is Duluth, Minnesota, because I didn't want to just pick on the South or tell stories in a conservative state like Oklahoma. which was one of the few states, I think maybe the only state that voted for Trump in both elections, every county, in Oklahoma. And in Duluth, it's about as close to Canada as you can snuggle up to Canada. Right up Duluth is up on the Great Lakes there. But in Duluth, there was a lynching in 1920 of 3 African-American men who were in town for a single day because they were working for a circus that was coming through town. And they were falsely accused by a white woman of sexually assaulting her. Right? They were jailed, and then a crowd of 10,000 people turned up in Duluth, which is a tenth of the population of the town at the time, drug them from the jail and lynched them on the town square. And that event went largely unknown and untold until about 20 years ago, and a group of people decided to tell the truth. So in all 3 of those stories, I'm really holding up groups that are trying to tell the truth about a very complicated past. And their mission, I think, is not to sort of beat up people who look like me, but to sort of establish a new foundation from which future generations can build something together. Because there's been such a conspiracy of silence, conspiracy of kind of hiding, and a kind of willful ignorance, right, of these events. I think that has prevented them from moving forward. So I can tell those stories in each of those 3 places. And I'm going to end with a little reading from the end of the book. And I do try to take to task, again, people with my backgrounds. I think that's, as an author, who I'm the most qualified to really talk to here at the end of the book in terms of where our responsibilities lie and kind of going forward, where we should go. So here's probably the most hard-hitting part at the end of the book that I talk about when, particularly I think people of white Christian background want to deny this history, want to suppress this history, and not tell it. So here's what I think we, white Christians, are really saying when we try to suppress this history. We would like to hold these truths to be self-evident. That we bear no responsibility for the actions of our ancestors, nor for the effects of their actions on the present. That hard work and individual merit are the keys to understanding both the path to the present and the possibilities of the future. The haves and the have-nots of today receive what they deserve based on the virtues of their individual past actions. It follows that no one, particularly hardworking white Christian people, should be made to feel uncomfortable because of what we now have. If anyone asserts otherwise, we are the ones being discriminated against. This land is our land, from California to the New York Island. We deserve to keep everything we've worked so hard to take. We have deeds in safe deposit boxes with our names on them, the veracity of which are guaranteed by a notary seal and a state we created for this purpose. As for the vast amount of wealth, we have histories that document our industriousness and our cunning, along with quarterly and annual statements that testify to our now long-held legal ownership. Furthermore, what we have done with the ultimate authority. Jesus is one of us. In case there was any doubt, we have made a likeness of Jesus in our image, the most widely distributed portrait in human history. We insist, both for ourselves and for others, on an inevitable present, one in which what was leads to what is, and what is will always be. It is not that we are against history. We know the importance of a good origin story. History, done rightly, explains how we got here. With our fences transforming land into property, our ledgers transforming labor and crops into capital, and our hands holding the receipts. The history of America, founded in 1776, is a Genesis story justifying the divinely ordained now, not a sloppy mess of narratives with multiple beginnings and contingent outcomes. Those who look like us own the publishing companies and hired our writers to tell the story of how we came to be America. Those executives also had the right connections to sell those packaged narratives to our public school boards, who handed books and lessons plans to our teachers, who in turn faithfully taught these stories to our children. And the circle remained unbroken, by and by, Lord, by and by. We know that slavery was a blemish on this country's record, and that this was mostly the cause of the Civil War. Still, there were good and noble people fighting on both sides. Even though slavery wasn't always as brutal as Hollywood depicts it, we're glad that sinful practice has ended, and that right after the Civil War was finally rectified by the good Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. whose eloquent words we now read in our churches and whose birthday we celebrate alongside Robert E. Lee. On the occasions when we think about it, we also feel bad about what happened to the Indians. But we also share Laura Ingalls Wilder's sentiments about the land in the early days of the country. Quote, "There were no people there. Only Indians lived there." In any case, we weren't personally a part of all that, and it was, after all, our missionaries who brought the Indians, with their primitive and savage ways, out of the darkness and into the light of Christian salvation. It was our government and our churches that coaxed those lost children out of the woods and into boarding schools, saving their souls and disciplining their bodies for more industrious pursuits like farming and factory work. We still honor their history with our athletic team names, mascots, and more recently with the occasional land acknowledgement, ritual and public events. We did finally give the Indians reservations of their own, and they seem to be doing fine with their casinos and government-provided health care and welfare subsidies. Finally, though, of course, there have been times when some Christians acted badly. They were acting against and not with the spirit of our faith. No true Christian would kill or steal or lie. This is the history we want our tax dollars to teach public school children. And many of our children are already getting this history in private Christian academies. We want our children to know that America is good, just like us.
Wow.
So I'll just wrap it there. Let's see what you want to talk about.
Yeah, I've got kind of a question, but I'd like your comment on, first of all, it's astonishing, isn't it, that the Christians decided by this writ or in this commandment in a way to go out and do the most un-Christian thing they could possibly do, which is remarkable. And bringing it to the present day, I feel like this whole resistance to history, I'd like to hear your comment and what you've learned in your research about how that resistance, whether we see it now in Florida, but all around, and the people, like you say, who control publishing, the resistance is, we don't really want our kids to know that Meemaw's Meemaw, what they did. That we're their own personal history is, and that the whole idea that they don't want their children to feel bad. And the resistance to feeling, which of course is a roadblock to empathy. So in your research, this has been, on my mind, is sort of the primary, just kind of the real gut-wrenching reason why people are so resistant to this history. I'd like to hear your comment.
All right, I'm gonna fill out my seminary degree here for a minute.
Please.
So I grew up in Jackson, Southern Baptist, in Southwest Jackson, and I don't know where we white people got the idea that that Christianity is supposed to be comfortable. For one thing, right? Like historically, I've been to tent revival meetings out in farm fields, right? And in that tradition, some of you may have been to these like me, that there's traditionally this thing down at the front called a mourner's bench, right? And that mourner's bench was for people who were under conviction by the Holy Spirit that their lives were not right, right? And people would like wail and cry and sometimes roll around on the ground, right, as evidence of their wanting to change, right? It's like the most extreme discomfort, right? I mean, literally couldn't contain themselves. They were, this idea of being under conviction of the Holy Spirit, like this idea that God had such a hold on you and a hold on your conscience, right, that you had to change, like a deeply uncomfortable situation. But it led to change, right? That's kind of that, in my Baptist tradition, it's kind of part of what it's like. I wrote a piece, I'll just do a shameless plug here. So I write a weekly newsletter on Substack, which is a newsletter platform at robertpjones.substack.com. If anybody wants to sign up, it's free. I would love for you to join. But I wrote a piece on that newsletter called The Sacred Gift of White Discomfort. Because I really wanted to kind of push back on this idea, right? That if we think about it, like most of us, if there have been places where we've changed our minds or where we have grown out of kind of old ideas and into better new ones, it's been an uncomfortable process, right? I mean, it is. Because you got to realize, like, you weren't right about something, right? And it takes some wrestling with that to kind of come. It's a process. It takes a wrestling to come to a new place. And I think that frankly, that's where so many of folks who look like me and with my kind of Christian background are, in this place of excruciating discomfort. And I think it is personal, right? So I'll give you my own quick story. So in my family, on my mother's side, we have the kind of best genealogical records on her side. We have a family Bible from 1850 from her side. And in between the Old and New Testaments, it's got the genealogy records of kind of births and deaths and marriages and such for about 3 generations. And it turns out that was the generation on my mother's side of the family that first arrived in Georgia from Virginia in the early 1800s. Right? And so my first encounter with that Bible was as something that was handed down generation to generation. Finally, it was handed to me when I went to seminary. All right, and it was like this amazing object. It was like the most valued possession in my family, and it was both because it was old, but also because it was a religious object and represented a kind of Christian identity in my family. As we were doing more genealogical research, I also came upon it was made out. It's inscribed to my 6th great grandfather. His name was Pleasant Moon, 1850, and through some other genealogical research and looking for his name, I came across the estate settlement of his uncle who died. And it turned out he died in the same year, 1850. And so this document says, the goods and chattels of Pleasant Moon, deceased 1850. And it literally lists everything on the farm, right? And it lists, a table and 6 chairs, 1 bay mare, and then 3 lines down, it lists Naomi, a woman, at $400. Bird, a boy, at $150. And there's 4 human beings on this register. And then it just goes right back to forehead sheep and other objects. And I realized, like, this is both the legacy of my family, right? This kind of tradition on the one hand that espouses, like, we have several Baptist preachers, the founder of Dexter Memorial Baptist Church in Georgia is one of my ancestors, like that proud kind of history. And then it coexisted, right, with this commitment to enslaving and owning other people, right? And that's a very challenging kind of thing to hold together. And then the more, in sort of telling this story, the thing that become even more clear about that our origin story usually began with, well, we came down from Virginia, and got land in the Georgia land lottery in the early 1800s. Well, where does that land come from, right? That part was never part of the family lore. Of course, it comes from the Cherokee being pushed off those lands as part of Indian removal in the early 1800s against, in violation of U.S. treaties. The state of Georgia pushes them out, and then if you are of European descent, they carve all that land up into nice, neat 200-acre rectangles and just hand it out for free. And that's how my family gets to Georgia. So it is a challenging history, I think, to tell the story. But one of the things that has stayed with me and I'll close with this, but it's on this point, is that somehow we white Christian people in particular, have convinced ourselves that we're better off not knowing. Right? That somehow we're healthier, we're better not knowing that history. But we all know, you ought to know the truth about yourself. Because if you don't know the truth about yourself, so much of the present seems mysterious. Right? But if you know the truth about yourself and your origins and where you come from, things start making sense, right? You have family histories that start making sense, and our relationships between each other start making sense. The thing I was going to go to was James Baldwin, who's been a huge influence on my writing. Was asked one time what black people thought about white people, and particularly why there was not as much animosity as one might think from black people toward white people. And Baldwin said, well, many of us think of white people as the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. And that has really stayed with me, right? Because we tell these stories of impossible innocence, right? Of noble ancestors who treated everyone with respect and followed the law, right? And this, it's just an impossible history, right? But we tell it to sort of kind of lull our consciousness to sleep. And King picked up on the same theme about, when King, if I could make a plea here, for white people's use of King, I would say, like, if we really want to understand King, white churches should stop reading from the I Have a Dream speech. Like, that should be, like, banned from every white church going forward. And they should only read Letter from Birmingham. Right? If they really want to read something in a white church, that's what they should read. And there, what he says about, and these are the good white moderate churches he's talking about, right? Letter from Birmingham. What he says is, who are these white Christians sitting silently behind the anesthetizing power of stained glass windows? Right, that the sense that we have lulled our consciousness to sleep. Right, so it's a very similar sentiment to Baldwin, this slightly mad victims of our own brainwashing. So I think if we want to kind of work ourselves to anything like mental health, spiritual health, political health, we've got to be more honest with ourselves. And, you know, we will have these platitudes in Christian churches of, you know, you will know the truth and the truth will make you free, and we think that's an easy thing to say. Right, but in fact, it's kind of a radical thing, particularly with people with our past.
I applaud your answer.
I just want to tell you that Square Books on Martin Luther King's anniversary reads the letter. They ask the community to come and read parts of it.
Good.
A little plug for Square Books.
Yes.
Robert, I'd like you to fill in a few more gaps about yourself, just for curiosity, in terms of your education and other material that you have written,
Sure.
books and written about, and secondly, in terms of Christianity perspective, I'm wondering, has it changed over time? Is it, you know, from a European perspective to earlier American perspective, and is it still being debated, or is the law down on it, etc.? To kind of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll do the second one first. Mostly it's just fun to say that. But I was at the law school this afternoon with my friend Cliff Johnson back here. Some of you may know. And we were talking about how this gets integrated into U.S. law. So there's a case, Johnson v. McIntosh, the early 1800s, where the doctrine of discovery is explicitly cited as the reason for to say why only the federal government can hold title to indigenous lands, right? And they in the case, the reasoning just says, like, it's because of the superior genius of Europe and Christianity, right, that entitles them to these lands, and that our forebears thought that was sufficient justification, right, for claiming title to these lands. And it's just explicitly this idea embedded in the Christian doctrine of discovery. We also, so in my day job at Public Religion Research Institute, we do public opinion polling. We do surveys. We interview about 100,000 Americans a year on about a dozen polls every year, and we decided to ask to see, well, how live is this, 15th century doctrine of this idea of America as a promised land for your kind of divinely ordained promised land. So we actually put a question in a survey, and we asked exactly like that. Do you agree or disagree that the United States was intended by God to be a promised land for European Christians? Whoa. Stuck it in there exactly like that. And today, 30% of Americans agree with that. So 2-to-1 against, right, that reject that idea, but it's 30% agree. But one of the reasons why we're still fighting over 1776 versus 1619, and I'm hoping now 1493, a little bit, is because of the way this structures our political divides, right? In our binary partisan system, where we only have two major political parties, there's basically two groups among whom a majority agree with that statement. And they are white evangelical Protestants, that's my people, Southern Baptists and other evangelicals in the country, and Republicans, self-identified Republicans. The majority affirm that old idea, right, that the country is intended to be a promised land for European Christians. So, when you wonder why it seems like we're not really exactly fighting over the best way to solve policy in our big national debates anymore, or hell, even in the local school boards, we're not really talking about school policy. We're talking about American identity is what we're really fighting over, right? All the way from the local level to the national level. People running for local, dog catcher are going to be running on some campaign about American identity, right? To get votes. But I think it's because of the kind of moment we're in. And the other piece of the puzzle here is that our over the last 20 years, we've also undergone the sea change. Just kind of gets you the second of 2016 called The End of White Christian America. And that book is mostly a demographic book. Now, this book's more history. That was more demographics. And I was trying to trace out the shifting demographics in the country. And what I found is that we actually, in the last 20 years, crossed a very significant milestone in our country's history. And that is that we've gone from being, demographically speaking, a majority white Christian country to one that is no longer a majority white and Christian country. So if you go back to just the beginning of Barack Obama's run for president in 2008, the country is 54% white and Christian, right? So comfortably majority. By the end of his second term, that number dropped to 45%, and today it's 42%, right? So part of the alarm bells going off in the culture is this decline, right? And so the sense of, and I think it's what historians who don't pay enough attention to religion miss, I think, is that the dominance the kind of claims to dominance have always been ethno-religious in this country. They've not just been about race. They've not just been about religion. It's been that dominance, and we have a term, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? Has historically been the claim to dominance in the country. It's why the KKK, we often forget this, was anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish, right? Not just anti-black, because it was a Protestant Christian vision, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christian vision of the country that they were putting forward. And anybody else against that, it's why country clubs excluded Catholics and Jews. Right? Those are Protestant institutions, right? Meant to kind of uphold this kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. So when you have that decline, it's maybe no wonder we've got a little bit of a backlash, right, from this kind of shift from being a majority white Christian country to one that's no longer majority white and Christian. So that was the first book. The last book I wrote in 2020 was a book called White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. So the first book's kind of a demographic book. The next one is kind of a religion book about the kind of entanglement of white supremacy and Christianity. This was kind of a bigger canvas about long-term American history and how that all fits together in American history. But like I said, I'm a sociologist by training with a seminary degree, who also does public polling in Washington, D.C. So I've got a little bit of an odd mix. I did grow up in Jackson. I went with where I met Cliff, actually at Mississippi College. So I went to Mississippi College. I was a math and computer science major at Mississippi College, who went to seminary. I went to Fort Worth Baptist Theological Seminary, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, and then did a PhD at Emory in religious studies in Emory. So that's kind of my trajectory through. And then, my day job is running Public Religion Research Institute, where I'm the founder and president of that organization. But that's been the theme. But really, I mean, honestly, like I could boil it down to what really moved me into writing 3 books with the word white, and then 2 books with the word white supremacy, and then was honestly like a very simple thing. It was around 2014, 2015, trying to figure out why people who look like me with my background were so angry, and so aggrieved, and that was kind of what kind of started me on the path. Yeah.
Robbie, can you talk a little bit about politics? And we're in the middle of a gubernatorial campaign, statewide elections, and the driving issue, one of the driving issues in the campaign is the fear of trans girls playing high school sports and the threat that presents to the Republicans. And so there's this, you've used language that I like when you talk about conservative evangelical freak out moment.
Yes.
You're right, something's happening. Does your research define, clearly there's this notion that you have to protect our values as the most religious state in America against the other. Does that get defined in your research? Who's the threat, or what is the threat that we must be protected against?
Yeah, so one thing, and you and I have talked about, but one thing. So growing up here is I went back to Mississippi College, and just to kind of be as personal as I can about it. What's remarkable to me is going back there. Everybody knew MC was a Christian college when I went there. I knew it was a Baptist college. I went there. You go there now, it's got Mississippi College, a Christian university in big letters right on the banners. The quad where we used to play football and throw the frisbee You can't do that anymore because there's a humongous statue of Jesus watching the disciples speak in the middle of the quad right now, right? And it's this kind of overreach, I think, this kind of overreaction, right? I think it's indicative of this thing of, okay, we've got an outside thing where, and you know, for Southerners, right, we've got plenty of practice talking about outside advocates, right, in our history, right? So it's an easy lever to pull in our culture. So I think there's part of that going on. But I do think it is this demographic decline, right? This kind of the sense of like, oh, now we're really in the minority here, and we're no longer the demographic majority. But the other thing that's going on, I think, with not just transgender issues, but LGBTQ issues in general, is that there's a whole worldview that goes along with this doctrine of discovery, right? So we mentioned only one piece of it here, and that is Christians, everybody else, right? There's that, it's hierarchy, right? But embedded in that hierarchy, right, is also Europeans, everybody else. Men, women. Straight people, everybody else. And there's not even a category, right, for anybody other than men and women. But that's part of the kind of fixed hierarchical view of the world, right, where there are fixed categories, people are born into those categories, and they know their place. Right? And that's a very old idea, right? Knowing one's place, right? How many times have we heard that in this state, right? Stepping out of your place, right? Is one thing white people would say to black people all the time, right? If they like Emmett Till, if you touch somebody's hands, you give them change, right? If you don't step off the sidewalk, like, and in Rankin County this year, right?
The Goon Squad.
The Goon Squad, and what did they say? Right? What are they recorded saying? Get back on your side of the river. Right? You got to know your place. Right? Back to Jackson on the other side of the river, literally. So I think that's like the link. I think it's just some ways that it's also. Here's the other thing. The reason why I'm pretty convinced that the reason why I'm hearing so much about transgender people and less about same-sex marriage, right? So you remember when this 2004, we're hearing a lot of the same stuff about same-sex marriage. End of civilization, if we allow this to happen, you know, all this stuff. But here's what's changed, is I think and we can measure this in polls, that the vast majority of Americans today know someone who is gay or lesbian. The vast majority of Americans today do not know someone who is transgender. Right? It's still only about a quarter of the country that knows someone transgender. And I think you can count on that absence of personal contact and empathy that personal contact builds. I think as one reason why this issue can get pulled off, right, and kind of singled out, and it's an easy target.
Robbie, you know I follow you pretty well, but I'd just like to issue a warning to the audience. I love your data and your research and the results, but you might want to be sitting down and maybe have a vodka tonic because it will scare the you-know-what. Some of the results of some of those surveys are shocking that many people in that particular subgroup feel based on your questions. And I just encourage everybody to start following it. But be ready. Be prepared.
Thank you.
I just want to share a little anecdote. A couple years back, I was in Bradenton, Florida, like a family gathering, and I took off to do my, power walk so I could stay sane. And I ended up like on the Bay area of Bradenton, which is south of Tampa. This whole De Soto park emerged in front of me, where it was like these paths through the brush by the water, and images of De Soto, images of Native Americans, and then crosses. I came across this huge cross and these statues of monks. I was like, what is this park, and when are they going to take it down? I mean, it was amazing. And then these stories written down. I was like, ooh, that needs some clarification. I mean, it was just popped up. I was like, what is going on?
It's also remarkable because it was actually quite a failed expedition. Sort of died. He's surreptitiously buried in the Mississippi River, so the indigenous people won't know he's died, right? And they lose half of the expedition by the time they get back to Florida. It's not a success. right? I think the only thing they came back with was like, some shells and a few beads. I mean, no gold, no riches, right? And
a possum.
And as they were sitting on these, like, the indigenous people, like, were playing, right? They would tell them these, oh yeah, just 3 days that way, and gold.
Go.
And then take off, right? And so anyway, it was not a success, but the only success it did do is because they recognized this symbolic planting of that cross on that space. And the way it worked is if you planted a cross in a watershed, you got to claim the entire watershed.
Oh, wow.
Right? And so it was a huge claim just by him showing up on the shores of the Mississippi River. And that's why it's in the Capitol Rotunda today, because it's part of that huge land claim of the interior. Yeah.
Mississippians dealing with their history is a sensitive subject. And I speak out of personal experience. Having to renounce, if you will, my people in order to tell the truth somehow misses something. And I was listening to a young preacher with a wonderful homiletic style who talked about loving our history and lamenting. It's a both and. It's not either or. And only when that happens can we find healing to do something creative and constructive in the present. I guess I'm asking, Mississippians, speak for my people, can't turn loose of their affection for the past, the pieces of it that they will never release. Can we give them permission to love and lament what their people did?
That's a great word. I still have a family Bible, right? And I still have really warm feelings about that Bible, right? I mean, those are my people. I wouldn't be here without those people, right? My grandfather, who I love dearly, who loved me dearly, was a deacon at Eastside Baptist Church in Macon.
Macon, Georgia.
Yeah. And in the early 1960s, like many churches, including the big tall steeple churches in Jackson, Galloway, and First Baptist, it was a closed, whites-only service. And his job was literally to be a bouncer on the front steps of the church. Like it was an official role for a deacon. And that was not uncommon. And so, that's my generation, right there. People that I know and love, and so it's. But I think there's something important about the complexity of that to kind of hang on to that, right? It's not. I mean, I think that's the challenge. It's not just good and evil, right? It's this like really challenging mixture of the two, and the problem has been that we haven't been willing to just sift it, right? We think we got to throw it all out, or we got to kind of, like I probably wouldn't use the words. Was it renounce or
love and lament?
The other one about renouncing our past or repeating our past, because I don't think that's helpful either, right? We actually have to know it, right, intimately, and claim it. There's no point in disowning it. It is our history. It is who we are, right? But I think again. Back to that, like, I just stayed with me, that slightly bad victims of our own brainwashing, right? In order for, like, I think white people don't realize, and white Christians in particular, I'm always shocked, don't grasp this more because of the whole idea of confession and repentance, right? And wholeness, right? And redemption, right? That cycle, right? That we talk about all the time in Christian theology. But, like, you don't get to health, right? Without confession, right? You don't get there. You can't repent if you don't confess. And like another metaphor that's been close to me, so I had a bout with cancer in 2011. It required surgery, chemotherapy, stage 3, really scary stuff, right? And what do they tell you when you get cancer? Maybe you've done this yourselves or had loved ones. The treatment is going to be hard, right? And in fact, if it goes wrong, the treatment might in fact kill you, right? But why do you sign up for it? Because you think there's a chance you're going to be healthy on the other side, right? And I kind of feel like this moment we're in is this kind of, particularly for white Christian people, we've gotten this diagnosis about ourselves, right? And we can either choose to forget about it and hope the cancer doesn't spread. We know how that goes, right? Or we can choose to deal with it, right? But dealing with it's going to mean some treatment, right? That's going to be challenging. It's going to mean like looking at those tests, those diagnostic tests, and going, oh, yeah, stage 3, okay, and really taking that in and not being in denial about it. But I do think there's this fear that that we can't deal with, right? But I'm hoping that we'll find ourselves sturdy enough to kind of hold the gaze, long enough that we'll kind of see kind of the way forward together. Because really, I do think at the end of the day, I'll kind of end with this. I think we're kind of getting close to time here, but we are faced with this question, right? So, are we a kind of promised land for European Christians? Is that who the country is? A divinely ordained promised land for European Christians, or are we a pluralistic democracy, right, where everybody stands on equal footing? And we have kicked that. We really that question has been with us. It's in our founding documents. It's in the Constitution. Those tensions are there, right? The Declaration of Independence has the term merciless savages to talk about indigenous people, and complains about Great Britain inspiring slave rebellions against the colonists, right? So that it's all there, right? And we've just kind of kicked this can down the road. But I think we're at a place where, in order for us to move forward together, we're finally going to have to make a choice here and pick, I think, finally the pluralistic democracy side of this, and for white Christians to stop pretending like we're supporting democracy while really supporting this other thing.
I gotta tell one funny story. This is because it's just a small group. Can I tell one funny story about Robbie? So Robbie's actually good at math. He's good at school. So he goes back to our alma mater, Mississippi College, which is a deeply complicated place, where they love the Lord. And
Amen.
And they recognize Robbie, I think, as outstanding alumnus in mathematics. They bring him. Well, it turns out he's written some best-selling books. What's that? Well, one of them is called "The End of White Christian America." Well, we need somebody to talk about that, because that is something that's what worst thing could happen for America if you're at Mississippi College than the end of white Christian America. Not having read Robbie's book or kept up with him much, they promote Robbie to speak about what they in chapel. What they perceive to be a lamentation about the end of white Christian America. Robbie gets protested by the Black Student Association and other progressives for coming in here to defend white Christians. It's a complete disaster. Nobody understands. They don't know who Robbie is. He was just good at math. So he has to, I don't know, you have to go back to chapel and explain to everybody, all of you got the wrong guy. You don't know me very well, do you?
And Mississippi College doesn't read books.
Googled my name in white supremacy and got a Grand Wizard of KKK in Texas. And that was flying around social media.
So in the words of Bugs Bunny, you don't know me very well, do you?
Thank you very much.